The Helen Suzman Foundation has welcomed the High Court ruling barring Home Affairs Minister Aaron Motsoaledi and his department from arresting, deporting and detaining anyone who doesn't have a valid ZEP. Motsoaledi's decision to terminate the Zimbabwe Exemption Permit, which would affect more than 178,000 people living in South Africa, has been declared invalid and unlawful and indeed unconstitutional. So, how has this news been received, particularly by the Zimbabwean diaspora that lives in South Africa? Let's speak now to the Diaspora Global Network CEO, Dr. Vusumuzi Sibanda, who joins me in studio now. Dr. Sibanda, thank you very much for your time. So, let's begin with how the news has been received.
Good morning and thank you very much. Well, look, I think it's very good news, and as we have always said, in the past, that the important thing was that there are constitutional rights, that obviously have been violated, and, that over time, people get to have better rights that they accrue, and that all what we required in the first place was for the minister to follow due process and to also recognize that, where there are rights, certain things would have to happen in order for him to take a decision of that nature.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that did not happen, but, well, it is really very good news, to the, ZEP holders.
Make us understand, therefore, what your message, what your advice is to Zimbabwean nationals who are in South Africa as per this ZEP.
Okay, what basically that means now in our advice would obviously be that because that court ruling basically means that the minister has not taken a decision because the decision is invalid. So basically it's as good as if we've been living in a vacuum, for all this period, starting from the 31st of December 2021. So the people that have made, those waivers, those applications, they might as well go back and say, well, Minister, you've basically robbed us of our money because you never took a decision and you informed us that we must go and apply for waivers because we do not qualify. And the minister would be faced with a situation where you would have to refund all the 1,550 for about over 100,000 people that have approached him, because that is based on invalid decision. Otherwise, they would not have done that. So they were misled into doing that. So the minister could find himself facing a very serious lawsuit at the moment, and people cannot even continue now to apply for those waivers because they mean nothing, because the minister has to start afresh.
Yeah.
Basically, he's got to reconsider if he needs to go that route, because that judgment is actually what you'd call a lesson 101 on how to take a decision and why you would have to. And what that means is, if he reads that judgment properly, he would realize that he does not have the proper basis, for even withdrawing that, because there were grounds upon which, those ZEP were given based on. And he must show that now.
Let's actually tackle exactly what you have just said.
Yes.
There were grounds.
Yes.
Upon which this dispensation was given to the people of Zimbabwe. Remind us what those were.
The grounds at that particular stage was that there was an influx, of Zimbabweans because of the political and economic situation.
Yeah.
If you would remember, in 2007, there was even a runoff, and then a government of national unit which was brokered by South Africa because of the serious political instabilities, and people had started flocking into South Africa as early as 2000, after the land invasions, and then, when ZANU-PF had lost, the majority in parliament. Yeah. So there were serious, brutalization, of people to the extent that they ran into South Africa. And the minister himself acknowledges that there were so many people that were seeking asylum, and to the extent that the asylum system was overwhelmed. Now, by merely saying that, the minister is practically saying that the people were fleeing political persecution to the extent that they required to get asylum. Now, then there was a diversion to say, well, look, our system is overwhelmed. Let's just give these people a dispensation. Now, that does not take away the fact that these people remain asylum seekers until when they can say, well, look, I think things have changed.
Yeah.
And the minister says things have changed, but in court it came out that things haven't changed. In 2018, we saw 6 people being killed in broad daylight by soldiers. So now the minister is allowed to withdraw a dispensation on good grounds. So the minister needs to show that there is good grounds. He needs now to compare what caused the dispensation to be initiated.
Yeah.
Has that situation abated? Has it improved? Is it now, is it now not there to the extent that now he can bring that, dispensation to an end.
And here's why I was building up to this. Because I asked you what your advice is to the people of Zimbabwe. I asked you again what the conditions were that allowed for this ZEP dispensation by the South African government to be implemented. The reason, particularly around the advice to people who hold the ZEP, is that the government of South Africa will not have this ZEP in perpetuity. It's a government, and they have a right to implement something, and upon assessing, reverse or perhaps terminate. So that's why I'm asking you what your advice is to people of Zimbabwe who are in South Africa as per that ZEP, because again, if you listen carefully to the words, it's not going to be there in perpetuity.
Look, I think one of the things that the minister had said at one stage, which was a very good statement, was that the ZEP was very restrictive. Because the conditions that were put on the ZEP made it impossible for the holders, to really have, some kind of a life moving forward. It meant that you could only do, that you could not change a profession or anything, that you had applied for. So that was a very true statement, and indeed it is very, very, inhibitive. But now, as true as we say that the government of South Africa has a right to change, now that's why when I started I said, look, rights, people, begin to, rights accrue. People develop rights, over a given period of time because of, certain circumstances. Now, you will realize that ordinarily, when somebody applies, for example, for permanent residence, it is given on the basis that the person is ordinarily resident in a particular country. Now, this is one thing that we're running away from. And that ordinarily resident varies from 3 to 5 years. Now, when you are said to be ordinarily resident in a particular country, it means that you have almost cut ties with the other country where you are residing, and you have established yourself in a particular country. And that right now gives you access, to a better right of residence. So, if you look at the ZEP, people have lived for, under the dispensation itself from 2009 up to now, 2023 now. It's
so
almost
10 years.
Exactly. So what that means is that where is that right of residence? We're now looking at the interpretation of statutes, where basically you're saying you want to ascertain what was in the mind of the legislator when he said ordinarily resident in a particular country. Now, people will lose, in some cases, citizenship if they stay outside the country for over 12 months. Because you are taken to be ordinarily resident somewhere else. So if there is a negative right that comes with staying away for a given period of time, why is the positive right that accrues as a result of residing in a particular country over a period of time not to be recognized in this particular case?
It's a pickle for the South African government, because how you're putting it now is that it's almost as if the ZEP holders, they must be almost considered permanent citizens of South Africa. How do you respond to a Zimbabwean minister who's going to come here and say, why don't my people come back to my country? Let's rebuild Zimbabwe. And I can tell you that, and you know it, ZANU-PF ministers have been saying this for some time, to say, there's nothing wrong in Zimbabwe. Come back. Let's rebuild.
Look, it's a PR stunt. And, we welcome politicians politicking every day. And for starters, if somebody says, no, let my people come back, you must remember that, people have the free will to make a choice that, I want to stay where I want to stay. And in some cases, government action forces people, like in this particular case. The people of Zimbabwe did not leave, out of their own free volition because it was an issue of saying, I want, just to change of circumstances. The political environment, the economic, which is still persisting at this particular moment, made it impossible for the people to continue residing there. So when a person comes here and gives a political statement to say, let these people come, and, then you look at what the government of South Africa can do. The government of South Africa says, but is there a right? Yes, there is a right that is accrued as a result of the people staying. So you can't say, your people, because even the government of South Africa, it cannot go to, Russia or Ukraine today and say, I want these South Africans that have come here not to be given permanent residence and stay there. People have their reasons. But in this particular case, I think the good thing, the best thing that would have happened is for the South African government to engage on a genuine basis. You see, when the president was
engaged with who?
With the government of Zimbabwe. when the president of South Africa recently spoke, about how Africa has been treated, when he was addressing, the meeting, and, when there was, France and all the other presidents, that, look, we have felt like we are beggars.
Yeah.
We have not been treated right. I think that kind of frank talk is what we need in Africa. Because our presidents cannot sit together as if, nothing is wrong. When half of South Africa is here,
So in essence, let's just try and summarize it this way. In essence, what you are saying is that the South African government is, one, reaping the fruits of what they have sowed because of quiet diplomacy that they have been engaged in over years, watching the Zimbabwean situation. And I'm talking about the time when Robert Mugabe was still alive. That's what you are saying.
It's actually more. I'm actually saying that the government of South Africa is a partner in crime. Because the courts have ruled that, when something unconstitutional or wrong, especially that affects the rights of people, is taking place in Zimbabwe, cases can even be opened here in South Africa. And the government of South Africa has seen people being brutalized. They sent a commission in 2018 when 6 people were killed, live ammunition by soldiers on the streets. And the government of South Africa never took a proactive step to say, wait a minute, we can't have this in a democracy that we have like today. So, I mean, the SG of the ANC recently said, half of Zimbabwe is in South Africa, the whole. But he went on to lambast, the opposition. He says, we don't know whether we call it charms or what. But he's not saying, Chams was not there and not doing anything when the people were flocking. Why doesn't he ask the question and say, fellow ZANU-PF colleagues, why is half of Zimbabwe in South Africa? Let us address the elephant in the room. And the government is therefore complicit in this problem.
Is it not confusing? Is it not confusing, particularly for a South African citizen? And you know the complaints. I'm not going to replay them for you. You know what South Africans feel about their fellow Zimbabweans who live side by side them. But here's a situation where Nelson Chamisa comes on the one weekend to say, come, let's go home. Go and vote. After voting, do you think he's going to encourage them to stay, or he's going to say, okay, now you've done your deed, you can go back to South Africa? How is the South African citizen supposed to digest this?
Look, I think the opposition part, like Chamisa, all he wants at this stage is that, look, let's have people coming in and voting so that we can have the huge numbers and, maybe protect, the vote from being stolen. But the vote has been stolen since the last 20-something years. And it's unfortunate that I would have to say that, the opposition should be in a position to, people vote, and they should be able to protect the vote when it has happened. Yeah. And unfortunately for the South African citizen, it's a very huge dilemma. I mean, it's a very sad story because the bulk of the South African feel that, look, maybe, the people of Zimbabwe can go on the streets and protest like we do in South Africa, to show their displeasure and take action. But unfortunately, the situation is not really the same, because in Zimbabwe, you get killed. You get thrown into prison, your rights are thrown away. I mean, look at what has happened to Job Sikala, Ngarivume. You get thrown away forever. Everybody forgets about you. Yeah. So there's no rule of law there. And unfortunately, for South Africans that are just new with independence, where they've just been fighting apartheid, they believe that, when you go out and fight, things are going to happen. But what they probably may not realize is that, when South Africa was fighting apartheid, they were also being assisted by the same African countries that said it was wrong. But now, these African countries, they don't want to assist now because they say, if you're fighting ZANU-PF, then it means that you are counter-revolutionary, you are becoming a terrorist. So no one is going to affect, the affected Zimbabweans.
I'm out of time. I think you may have said something, not realizing that you're saying it. You're saying that in Zimbabwe there's a rule of law there. I think you mean to say there's no
rule of law. Yes. There is no rule of law. I'm sorry if I said that. Yes.
All right. Mm-hmm. Okay. Dr. Vusumuzi Sibanda, let me thank you very much for your time. He is the CEO of the African Diaspora Global Network. Thanks indeed for your time, sir.